Good morning, all. It's wonderful to see y'all here. Thank you for coming out. My name is Dan Turner. I'm head of programming and outreach for the Georgetown County Library, which is celebrating its 225th anniversary this year. So happy birthday to the Georgetown County Library. All the way back in 1799, library services started here in Georgetown. So that's an amazing, that's 1 year older than the Library of Congress. So it's impressive. So we can give a round of applause. And we did have our director, Dwight McInville, on Tuesday for Tuesdays With. He talked about the history of the library. So that video, if you weren't here, it'll be available online soon, thanks to our videographer, Aaron Brickle, who's also videoing this presentation today. And Dwight actually wrote his master's thesis at UNC Chapel Hill about the history of the Georgetown County Library. So it's a very rich history here at the Georgetown County Library, and we're having this wonderful celebration of 225 years. And thanks to the wonderful Julie Warren, our Georgetown County digital librarian, who happens to be in the back there. We also have some great swag. And it's over there right by our featured speaker today on the side there. We got some pens, we have some pencils and some notepads, magnets. So please pick up some swag before you go. Take this with you and help us celebrate the library's 225th birthday. This series that we're so grateful that you're a part of today, it's sponsored by South Carolina Humanities, a part of the National Endowment for Humanities. So we're grateful to them for sponsoring this series, which continues. It'll keep going each Thursday this fall at 10 a.m. So catch some more of the presentations. We have some flyers over there that you can collect as well. And that enables us to get wonderful speakers like Paige Sawyer. He's a Georgetown County legend who will be speaking today about a Georgetown County legend. So we have a cardboard cutout of General Francis Marion that Paige brought with him today, but someday we might have a cardboard cutout of Paige Sawyer himself, and somebody's going to be talking about Paige Sawyer up here. Paige Sawyer is a 7th generation South Carolinian with family roots here stretching back to the mid-1700s. So, he knows his stuff about Francis Marion. Born in Aiken and raised in Columbia and Charleston, he's been all over the state. Sawyer has resided in Georgetown for over 50 years. He entered the Army and was selected for the top secret Army security agency. In this capacity, he served in the U.S. war in Vietnam from March 1969 until October 1979. He is an expert photographer and a local historian who hosts a Revolutionary War walking tour of Georgetown, so you can learn even more about figures like Francis Marion, and serves as a guide for low country tours, boat tours through Winyah Bay to North Island. And he is very much a Georgetown County treasure. So please welcome in Paige Sawyer.
Wow. Thank you, Dan. Buddy. Man, I was impressed with that introduction. I didn't know all that, so thank you. It's good to see so many familiar faces here today, friends, faces, newcomers. I'm glad to have you, and hopefully when you leave here, you're going to have a little more knowledge about the American Revolutionary War and our hero, Francis Marion. All right, before we get started, we want you to know that during the, if I can get everything to work, during the American Revolutionary War, South Carolina had more battles, engagements, and skirmishes were fought here in this colony than any other colony. Conservative estimates place the number of combat actions in our state at more than 200, a third of all that took place in the war. No other colony had as many battles skirmishes, and events in any other state or any other colony than South Carolina. And this is a good way to look at it here. Now, if you look at the very top, you'll see battles per colony, 1775 to 1783. And then if you look down here, you'll see 1775 to 79 is in blue, 1780 to 83 is in red, and the ones involving Francis Marion are in green. Now look at the names of the colonies to your left, and then go to your right, and you can see how many battles, skirmishes, engagements were in South Carolina. There are 3 rows. All the other colonies just have 1 row. And you can see how many green ones are in South Carolina that are associated with Francis Marion. Now, the Revolutionary War was not only fought between the British and American soldiers, but there was a civil war going on also between friends, neighbors, and families. Those who sided with the British were called Tories and Loyalists. They believed that they should obey the king, King George III. They came from varied backgrounds, and some were rich landowners who did not want to lose their land. Some were religious leaders and thought that the king received his power from the Almighty God. Some were government officials and didn't want to lose their jobs. And those fighting for freedom from the king, they were called patriots, Whigs, partisans, and rebels. They believed that they should have their own independence and not have to obey a king. The patriots, Whigs, partisans, and rebels also came from varied backgrounds, and most had working class jobs. They were silversmiths, painters, lawyers, landowners, and businessmen. Now, at the beginning of the war, if you hold up one hand, you'll have 4 fingers and 1 thumb. At the beginning of the war, 2 of every 5 citizens were for the king. 2 of every 5 citizens were for independence, and 1 of every 5 citizens was neutral, didn't really know which way to go. So that's how divided the country was at that time at the beginning of that war. The British soldiers, as you can see in this illustration, I must confess something. Now, a lot of the images you will see here today, I copied, plagiarized, or stole them out of books and or charts or whatever I could find. So I'm guilty as charged. But I want to assure Dan and Dwight and the library system that no books were harmed during this process. Okay? All right, so we're still friends? All right, now this illustration here was taken from the book Partisans and Redcoats by Walter Edgar. He wrote the book sometime around 2000. But if you look on the left, you'll see the British soldiers in their green and red uniforms and their flag. Now on the right, you're going to see a whole variety of uniforms and clothing. You see this good old guy right here. You see some soldiers. You see some Indians. You see some blacks. Some of the blacks were slaves. Some of them were free people. But all this group on this side, they were fighting for their independence from the King of England. Now, we don't know who the patriot is on horseback, but we're going to say that's Francis Marion. Does that sound okay? All right, let's do that. Now, if we put you in a time machine and take you back to January of 1781, now this isn't a real wanted poster, but it's something we found in Florence. Let's put you in a time machine and take you back to 1781. You're in the colony of South Carolina, and the Tories and the Whigs, the goods and the bads, are talking about someone named Francis Marion. He's the most wanted man in the colony of South Carolina. The British and the Tories despise him, while the patriots, partisans, Whigs, and rebels love him. Although Francis Marion was born in neighboring Berkeley County, Georgetown has a special place in its heart and history for this great American. He was born the same year as George Washington in 1732. That's not George. And Francis was the 5th son of 6 children born of his parents. Peter O'Ree, this is Peter O'Ree here. Now he's a Georgetonian. He owned Belle Isle Plantation out on Winyah Bay. Horry County and our neighboring county is named after Peter Horry. Peter Horry and Francis Marion would meet later in life, and they became lifelong friends. And Peter Horry said this about Francis Marion. Francis was a puny child when he was born. I have it from good authority that this great soldier at birth was not larger than a New England lobster and might easily have been put into a quart pot. In spite of his scrawny body and poor health, Francis had a happy childhood. His family had several slaves, and one was named Oscar, but Francis called him Buddy. Buddy and Francis would become best friends. Buddy was his servant, his confidant, and his companion soldier. And Buddy also had musical talent and played the fiddle. Now, when Francis was around 4 or 5 years, here's Buddy. When Francis was 4 or 5 years old, his family moved to Georgetown. We don't know where. We just, all the books say Winyah Bay, but we don't know the exact spot. And his mother, he told his mother, Francis, living on Winyah Bay, he was fascinated by the ships that were coming in and going out. And little boys, they have large imaginations. They would look at that big ship and say, wow, I wonder where that where it came from or where it's going. Look, there's another one over there, Mama. Mama, when I get to be a big boy, I'm going to get on one of those big ships, okay? Thank you, ma'am. When I get to be a big boy. All right, good. Well, when he was about 16, he got his chance. He got on one of those ships. He was with a crew of 6, and they went down to the Caribbean. And upon their return, a whale, legend has it, a whale came up out of the water and turned the ship over. So they didn't have time to gather provisions, water, food, anything. But they were thrown into the water. They found a lifeboat. They got onto the lifeboat. The little dog that they had on the boat came to them. They picked him up, put him on the boat, and that was all they had. And they were out in the Caribbean drifting. Well, unfortunately, 2 of the crew died from exposure, and that little dog became their next meal. So they had to sacrifice him to continue leaving. Well, Francis Marion, he finally got home. And when he got home, the first person he wanted to see was his mama. And he said, Mama, I will never get on another boat as long as I live. And she was happy, and we as future Americans can be happy also because he became one of the greatest Revolutionary War fighters in American history. In 1750, Francis' father, Gabriel, died, and we think he is buried at Prince George Winyah Cemetery. There are no markers, but we believe that's where he is buried. We know his brother and his wife are buried there. After his father died, his mother, older brother Gabriel, and sister moved back to Berkeley County. His mother died, unfortunately, about 2 years later, and he went to live with his brother Gabriel and his wife Catherine at Belle Isle Plantation in Berkeley County. Now, Belle Isle, same name as the Belle Isle we have here. This plantation was Gabriel's wife inherited it when they were married. So they had a nice place to live, and Francis went to live with them. Francis became a farmer, but around 1759, the Cherokees in the western part of the state, you see it up in the top left, they started harassing the colonists. So Francis, he volunteered and was given a commission in the state militia. He trained and fought with the British soldiers and observed how small groups of Indians could attack large groups of British soldiers, do some damage, hit and run, hit and hide, and take off and never be seen again. Francis Marion, he put that in his head. I like the way they did that. He didn't know he was going to use that tactic later in years, but he said, I like the way they did that. But something he didn't like about the British soldiers was the way, after they fought the Indians, they would burn their villages. They would shoot their livestock. They would burn their crops. There was complete devastation to the Indian village. So Francis Marion didn't agree with that philosophy of, devastating the Indian village after they had fought them. He later told Peter Horry he always regretted that part of his life. The Indian hostilities ended, and Francis Marion returned home and bought some property on the Santee River and gave it the name Pond Bluff. Now, obviously, you know this car wasn't there when Francis Marion was there. And actually, Pond Bluff burned, and it was rebuilt by a past landowner after Francis Marion died. And supposedly, this is a replica of the home that Francis had at that time. The Indian hostilities ended, and Francis moved back home and bought some property on the Santee River and named it Pond Bluff. Even though he was only 5 feet 2 inches tall, he was a full-grown man at this time. He had the appearance of a 13-year-old, but he had knocked knees and malformed ankles. He walked with a limp. He had a hooked nose, narrow face, high forehead, and a very homely appearance, and he walked with a pronounced limp. In other words, if you were a lady, stand up a minute, Sandy. If you were a lady walking down the street and Francis Marion passed you, you would look at your husband and say, "Damn, that's a homely looking man. Bless his heart." Thank you. So he wasn't anything, good to look at. And he walked with a limp. He was small, and you just felt sorry for him when you saw him. In 1775, Francis and his brother Job were elected delegates to the Provincial Congress. He was appointed as captain to the South Carolina 2nd Regiment and was with Colonel William Moultrie during the 1776 Battle of Sullivan's Island down in Charleston. This was one of the first major battles of the Revolutionary War, and the Patriots proudly defeated the British. The victory helped convince undecided delegates to vote in favor of a Declaration of Independence. And for the next 3 years, this is the origin of the South Carolina state flag. It was blown down. Sergeant William Jasper, he picked it up, put it on a cannon sponger, and put it back up. Now, at this time, the flag, blue, indigo blue, it had a crescent in the upper left-hand corner. Some people say it had Liberty on the crescent. Some people say it was on the bottom of the flag. Either way, this was the origin of our state flag. All right, so the Declaration of Independence was issued that same day, and it was later signed in August of 1776. So at that time, we were officially relinquishing our relationship with Great Britain. Now, in May 1780, the British captured Charleston, and 2 months later, they captured Georgetown. Georgetown was the second largest city in South Carolina, plus it had a port which allowed the British more access to needed supplies. Throughout the occupation, the corner of Broad and Front, all right, here are the British coming into Georgetown. This is the 1720 map of Georgetown that was the original, the way it was when it was laid out. The British, they get these barges. They put a couple of guns on them, go up the rivers, fire at the plantations, tell them, all right, the king has taken over this property. You're going to be our subjects from now on. Do you understand? If not, there's going to be a severe penalty. Throughout the occupation, the corner of Broad and Front Street, where present-day Rolling Local restaurant is located, was the British headquarters. This was the structure that was there at that time, on the corner of Front and Broad, where present-day Rolling Local is. Captain John Artisoff, he read a proclamation, and there's a plaque on the side of that building indicating that this was the headquarters in the Revolutionary War. Captain John Artisoff, British captain, read a proclamation to the residents of Georgetown informing them that they must show their support to the king and take up arms against patriot rebels. This building was, let's back up. The building they used was demolished in the early 1900s and replaced with the Rolling Local building. From this building, the parade ground on Broad Street and the jail down on Broad Street, which was used as a fortification, could be seen from the British headquarters. Many of the British officers took over the homes of locals and forced them to live elsewhere. Here are two of the homes that the British officers stayed in. There are several others, but these two are they were the closest ones. Now, it was from the headquarters building that John James, he was a gentleman from Williamsburg District, King Street, over in that area. He heard that the proclamation had been read, and he was sort of the leader of the town at that time, and he wanted to make sure he understood it correctly, so in case some of his citizens asked him what was going on, he could tell them. So he dressed as a farmer, rode his horse from Williamsburg District to Georgetown, went to this building and asked to see Captain John Artisoff. And he said, "Sir, I am John James from Williamsburg, and I need to know the full extent of this proclamation. Is it true that if I do not take up arms against my relatives, against my neighbors, I could be hanged?" And the captain said, "Yes, sir, you're exactly right, and you ought to be hanged right now for even questioning me." Well, John James, he didn't like the way that captain responded to him, so he picked up a chair and swung it at him, hit him upside the head, knocked him down, and before he could get up, John James had run out of the building, got on his horse, and hightailed it back to Williamsburg.
Wow.
You talk about getting somebody mad. So we went back to Williamsburg. Now, word spread throughout Georgetown and Williamsburg districts. It was at this time some men in Williamsburg district, when John James came back and told them what they had to do, they said, "We're not going to do that. We have friends, we have family, we have neighbors. We don't want to show allegiance to the king. We're going to fight them. We need a leader." John James says, "Well, I know somebody named Francis Marion. We'll get him to come up and lead us." So they got in touch with Francis Marion. Francis Marion came up, met them at Witherspoon's Ferry. If you're on Highway 51 going through Johnsonville, you leave Johnsonville, there's a bridge. That was Witherspoon's Ferry. There's a monument over there for Francis Marion, indicating that this was where Marion's brigade was formed. Now, Marion was introduced to his men just outside of Johnsonville at present-day Witherspoon's Ferry. Now, the men, they were a mix of farmers, merchants, slaves, free blacks, and several Native Americans. They were a motley, ragtag-looking bunch of men, ages 16 to 60. Most were dressed in homespun, some were barefoot, all were mounted, and each had a weapon of some kind. Francis Marion, he was greeted with happy shouts as the men crowded around him, and they got to get a good look at the man who had been sent to command them. Some may have been disappointed because Francis Marion, like I told you, he was not a very imposing military stature. He was nearly 48 years old, short. He was only 5'2", short and a bit on the frail side, with his ankles and knees obviously malformed, and he walked with a limp. His visage was hard. His black eyes were steady, while a high forehead sat above a face dominated by a jutting jaw and a hooked nose. Like Sandy said, bless his heart. Instead of an officer's sword, he had a little cut and thrust sword that hung in his waist, and it was said that the sword actually rusted and he couldn't get it out of the scabbard because he never used it. Now, he took Marion's men, the brigade, they went to North Carolina to see the commander of the southern colonies and to volunteer their help for the cause. Well, one of the officers described Marion's men as they were distinguished by small black leather caps and the wretchedness of their attire. Their number did not exceed 20 men and boys, some white, some black, and they were all mounted, but most of them miserably equipped. At their head rode a small 48-year-old man who, at 5 feet 2 inches tall, 110 pounds, he possessed the physique of a 13-year-old boy. He had knock knees, deformed since birth, easily touched one another. His hooked nose and narrow face gave him a homely appearance, and he walked with a pronounced limp. Yet his flashing black eyes and steely demeanor along with his blue Continental uniform, rumpled though it was, captured the mocking soldiers not to laugh at this ragged group in their presence. Well, the commander looked at them, said, why don't y'all just go on back to South Carolina, burn some bridges, capture some ferries, and spy on the British? They said, that's fine, that's what we'll do. Now, Augusta on the western side of the state, 96 on the western side of the state, Camden in the middle of the state, and Georgetown, they were captured by the British. And there were little supply depots in between Charleston and those areas. So the soldiers in Charleston had to supply these places with horses, with food, with ammunition, with powder, whatever they needed. So Francis Marion said, well, that's who we're going to attack. We're going to attack those supply convoys, and we're going to, not let them furnish the goods to these outlying posts. Now, Francis Marion's area of operations was this area right in here, from the Santee River to the PD. Now, they would attack the supply wagons, supply convoys, usually the rear, usually at night, and they would do just like Francis Marion had learned from the Indians. They would surprise, hit and hide, hit and hide. And by the time the British realized what was going on, they were gone. They couldn't find them. Now, while hiding in the woods or on someone's plantation, they had very little to eat unless the owner of this farm or plantation could supply a cow, sheep, pig, whatever. But these good old boys, they were good with their rifles. Wasn't a squirrel, possum, or raccoon that got away from them. They killed them all. And they ate those, and they always had an abundance of sweet potatoes. Most of their meals consisted of sweet potatoes. Now, if one of Marion's men came from a fairly well-to-do family, he would bring a pewter plate with him. But not all of Marion's men were wealthy enough to have pewter plates. Plus, when they ran out of bullets, guess what was melted to make more bullets? Pewter plates. But there was always an abundance of bark, pieces of trees, and they would put that in their saddlebag or whatever, and this was their plate when they ate. Now, a famous painting was done by John Blake White. He gave it to the U.S. Senate in 1896, and there have been many examples of this. Now, supposedly this happened outside Georgetown. Francis Marion, British officer. There's a POW that they want to swap. Francis Marion has a British POW, the British have a Patriot POW. So they blindfold the British officer, take him to this camp that's hidden. They release the blindfold. He looks around. He and Francis Marion talk. They converse the negotiations with the prisoners. And Francis Marion says, why don't you stay and have supper with us? And the officer says, I would be delighted. So they invite him for supper. And you can see what they're preparing, sweet potatoes. Now, some people mistaken this guy for Buddy, but it's been determined that the guy back here holding Francis Marion's horse is Buddy. The officer, he eats his potatoes, and they offer him some more. And he says, is this all you've got to eat? And Francis Marion says, yes, but, have seconds. We've got more tonight than we normally do. So this British officer, according to legend, he is so intent on how dedicated Francis Marion and his men are to hide in the woods, eat sweet potatoes, that he says we will never win a war against somebody as dedicated as these soldiers are. So supposedly he goes back to his commander, resigns his commission, and goes back to England. And like I say, there have been many variations on this painting. This was done by John Blake White also. I don't know who the artist was on this one. But I like the look on this soldier's face when he said, "Is this all we got? You know, are you kidding me?" And there's Oscar behind Francis Marion. Now, Francis Marion, he knows his men do not have enough weapons. So he goes through Georgetown, Williamsburg district and collects all the tree saws, you know, these big long saws that they cut down the big cypress trees. And he takes them to the blacksmiths and they make swords out of them. So he's now got swords along with his, what few weapons he has. Now Marion's men, Marion didn't tell any of his men when they were going, where they were going, or what the next battle or skirmish was going to be, because there were spies all over. Plus some of his men, they may leave him and go fight for the British. So the only person who knew what Marion's plans were was Buddy. And when Marion's men saw Buddy rolling up his bedclothes, packing up the stuff, they knew it was time to move. Now Marion, even though these were just good old boys from the woods, Marion was a strict disciplinarian with them. You got a little goatee, that's got to go. Jody, your hair is too long. You got to get a haircut. What you smiling at, sir? Yeah. Clayton, that beard's got to go. We can't have that. No long hair, no facial hair. But the men didn't mind it. They were used to Francis Marion's discipline. They liked the way he conducted himself, and they gave him every ounce of being that they had to stay devoted to him. Now the women, the wives, while the men were with Marion, the wives had to take care of the home front. Not only the home front, but the crops, the livestock, the children. And the women were just as dedicated to Francis Marion was as the men, because they knew, the women knew that Francis Marion was going to take care of their husbands, their sons, their fathers. So they were very dedicated to Francis Marion. All right, women, y'all can all be honest right here and let us know that y'all hear better than men, right? Look at Sandy smiling, Susan smiling, everybody smiling. You women are smiling. Y'all know y'all hear better than we men. Now, women were also good spies. You know, when they were walking around, the British didn't know if they were loyalists, whatever. And the women always listened to what those British were saying. They didn't say, "Hey, I like what you said. Hey, I'm going to repeat that, okay? I won't tell anybody you said that," but they remembered it in their head. And they all wore long dresses at that time with petticoats. And when they got home, if they had paper, pencil, whatever, they would write what they heard, pin it to the petticoat, and then make their way to some of Marion's hiding places and deposit that note. One of the hiding places was in the crypts behind Prince George Church. Some of those bricks were loose in those crypts. And they would wrestle it out, put that note in there, and one of Marion's men who knew where that crypt was, he would go there and get that note. There was a hat shop in Charleston, and the hat maker had a window, you know, in the front of the store, and if he had a hat on display with a feather in it, that was an indication that he had some intelligence for Marion's men. So one of Marion's men would go in there and they would, you know, tell him what they knew. So there were spies all around. Now, Prince George, the British stabled their horses in that church, and before they left, they burned it, but it was only partial because, thank goodness, the members of the church put it out before it could completely demolish the church. Another church they burned is in Indiantown, outside in between here and King Street. Now, they called the churches, not only were they houses of worship, but they were meeting places where you would go and talk business, civic affairs, whatever was going on. So the British called these sedition shops because they thought they were being used to conspire against the British. So the British completely burned Indiantown Church. It was rebuilt in 1830, and this is what it looks like today. Now, remember the guy from Williamsburg who came to Georgetown to talk to Captain John Artisoff? They burned his house at the same time, John James. Now, from King Street to Cheraw, South Carolina, is about 70 miles. And Captain John Weems, British officer, he was the second most hated man in the British Army. He and his troops, they had a path 15 miles wide and 70 miles long between King Street and Cheraw. And they burned every house, every farm, livestock, just devastated the landscape because of these people and their allegiance to Francis Marion. Now, you talk about Mama getting mad. When they busted into her house, she had her old Betsy, and she said, "You ain't getting my boy." Now, to show you how brutal they were, and I know y'all can read, execution of Adam Cusack. In August or September 1780, Major John Weems' 63rd Regiment of Foot marched from Georgetown to Cheraw, burning and looting Patriot houses and farms. When Adam Cusack, who ran a ferry over Black Creek, refused to take some British officers across, he was arrested. Convicted in an extra-legal court-martial, he was hanged nearby as his wife and children pleaded with Weems for mercy. That's how brutal the British were to the partisans. Now, Francis Marion, he was always hiding. Swamps were his hiding place. But have any of you ever camped in a swamp? It ain't the ideal place to pitch a tent. And so, his men, they stayed on plantations or farms when they spent the night. Plus, they were hoping they could get some victuals or something to eat while they were there. Francis was always on the move, like I told you. Only Buddy knew when they were going and where they were going. But when Buddy rolled up his bedroll or got his cooking gear together, they knew it was time to go. Now, how did the swamp fox get his name? Well, Francis Marion, let me see where I'm I want to give you the date. In November 1780, the most hated man in the British Army was Legion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton. Now, he chased Francis Marion for 7 hours and 26 miles through the woods, swamps, back roads to nearby present-day Manning, South Carolina. And he gave up. He told his men, "Come, my boys, let us go back and we will soon find the gamecock," meaning Thomas Sumter. But as for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him. So it was at that time Francis Marion became known as the Swamp Fox. This is Lieutenant Colonel Monastery Tarleton. Now, Georgetown, as you know, has 5 rivers that run through it. And these were the I-95s for Francis Marion. This is Francis Marion on the PD. They would put their men, their horses, their gear, whatever, on this barge. They would pole down the PD, the Winyah, to Winyah Bay, to Georgetown, wherever they were going. But this was their main mode of travel until they got to if they could control the ferries and the landings, they were good. Otherwise, they had to use the boats. Now, in January 1781, Francis's nephew, he was shot and killed about 3 miles west of here, where White's Bridge community is today. But there's a marker out there close to Stuart Ballard's place. Now, Snow's Island, from December to about February, December of 1780 to February of 1781, Snow's Island was the hiding place for Marion. And it's up on the upper PD River where the Lynch's River runs into it. It's about 50 miles from Georgetown. Now, the British in July of 1781, they see they're not going to win. So they leave Georgetown and go back to Charleston. And they would stay in Charleston until December the following year. But they came back in August of 1781 with a ship, with cannons, shot a few cannonballs into Georgetown, caught it on fire. The buildings on Front Street burned. And then the soldiers, they came into Georgetown and burned 42 homes. So can you imagine how many pre-Revolutionary War homes we would have right now had the British not come back in August of 1781 and burn the structures at that time? Francis Marion always regretted that he was not here at that time to save Georgetown. And you can see this marker about halfway down. In August 1781, much of the town was burned during a raid by the British privateer Manson. Toward the end of the Revolution, Georgetown became a valuable supply port for the American Army in the South. Now, the war was basically over for Francis Marion, so he goes back to Pond Bluff, and he becomes a farmer. He's also elected to, governmental offices, so he stays busy. And let's see here. When he got back to Pond Bluff, he found out it had been ravaged by friend and foe. The British had considered it a place to plunder, and the Americans had used it as a source of supply. They had pilfered his goods, burned his furniture and his house. They had driven off his cattle, confiscated his horses, and kidnapped what few slaves had remained. Francis Marion was destitute, but he was still unconquerable. He bought horses, cattle, feed, seed, and tools on credit, and somehow managed to furnish food and clothes for the loyal slaves. In October 1781, the U.S. Congress remembered Francis Marion with a resolution that said that the thanks of the United States and Congress assemble be presented to Brigadier General Francis Marion of the South Carolina Militia for his wise, gallant, and decided conduct in defending the liberties of his country. In 1783, Francis Marion was elected to the South Carolina Senate and received a gold medal in recognition for his military duty. He was serving when the South Carolina Constitution was drafted, and he also advocated for the forgiveness of the Tories who had sided with the British. He said, the war's over, so we fought our neighbor, so we fought our people down the street, but the war's over, let's come together and build our country. He wanted to reunite the state and bring everyone together for a new South Carolina. In March 1784, Francis Marion was given command of Fort Johnson in Charleston Harbor. His duty was to rebuild the fort, and his pay was 500 pounds a year. This was the only time in the last 5 or 6, 7 years that Francis Marion had received a paycheck. He was happy with his work, but he did not like living in Charleston. It was a place of high society, which didn't appeal to him. In 1786, at age 54, the lifelong bachelor Francis Marion married 49-year-old Mary Esther Badeau, who was a wealthy first cousin. And here you can see the newspaper article, Brigadier General Francis Marion, who served with great reputation in the late war, to Miss Mary Esther Badeau of St. John's Parish. So they went back to Pond Bluff, and she brought her wealth. She had some slaves also that she brought. Now, little is known about Mary's physical appearance, although a male friend who knew her once wrote that she closely resembled Marion facially, which was not exactly a compliment. And this story goes around. After they had been married a few years, there was a story that to learn of his wife's disposition before entering the home, he would take off his hat and throw it through a window. And if the hat stayed, he knew it was safe to go in, but if the hat came back out, ain't no way he was going in because she was upset, mad about something. A friend once stopped and said, "General, it is terrifically hot out here in the sun. Why don't you go in your house?" Marion answered, "It's hot out here, but it's a damn sight hotter in the house." Whatever happened to Buddy? Well, Buddy, Marion's faithful friend, remained his constant companion, and Francis rewarded him with a new fiddle. Francis, Mary, and Buddy would pack up and spend time traveling and visiting veterans who had served with them. Francis and Mary never had children, and Francis adopted his grandnephew, Francis Marion Dwight. He wanted an heir, but he and Mary, they were too old to have children, so he had grandnephews, and he adopted one of those and said, "If you do away with your last name, which was Dwight," his father named him Francis Marion Dwight, "you will be the heir to our family." And Francis Marion educated him along with several of the other nephews, and he looked out for his family. But unfortunately, Francis Marion Dwight married, and he and his wife only had daughters. So, the name wasn't carried. In 1794, a group of Georgetown citizens appointed a committee to draw up resolutions of gratitude for the services provided to Georgetown by Francis Marion. The first sentence of this proclamation reads, "We, citizens of the District of Georgetown, finding you no longer at our head, have agreed to convey to you our grateful sentiments for your former numerous services. Our children shall hereafter point out the places and say to their children, 'Here, General Marion, posted to advantage, made a glorious stand in defense of the liberties of our country.'" Nothing could have pleased Francis Marion more than this tribute from the citizens of Georgetown. Peter O'Ree, like I told you, he and Francis became good friends, and Peter O'Ree would leave Georgetown and go spend some time with Francis Marion. And he enjoyed sitting around the table with Francis and Buddy, or out on the porch with Francis and Buddy, where they could talk the old, the war stories. Francis Marion, his health affected by years of warfare, days in the field and nights in the swamp, had now begun to fail. As he approached death, he spoke thoughtfully of the great concerns of life, death, and the future, declared himself a Christian, a humble believer in all the virtual truths of religion. "Death may be to others," said he, "a leap in the burdens." He died February 27, 1795, in his 63rd year, and was buried at Belle Isle Plantation Cemetery, which was close to his home, Pond Bluff. We don't know much about Mary's life during the 20 years she lived after his death. Over the years following their deaths, now here you can see where she died on July 26, 1815. Over the years following their deaths, both Belle Isle and tombstones began showing years of wear. Due to deaths of other family members, low country storms, and general neglect, attention was needed to the family cemetery. A tall pine tree had fallen across the graves of Francis and Mary Esther. Thankfully, the state of South Carolina stepped in 1893 and said, "We need to do something for this hero of our state." So on May 22nd, 1893, to celebrate the unveiling of a new granite monument erected by the state of South Carolina over the grave of Revolutionary hero, more than 1,000 people of all classes and conditions of men, including several hundred Negroes, attending from all parts of Berkeley, Charleston, and Georgetown by dirt road and all sorts of vehicles, horses and wagons, and upon arrival of the northeastern train from Charleston. So they had a celebration. They did some work on the grave, put the marble slab on top, put a historical marker close to the cemetery, and that's what it looks like today. This was from an old postcard. Now, Francis Marion. In closing, let's back up. In closing, except for George Washington, more places have been named for Francis Marion than any other revolutionary figure. Marion has lent his name to 29 cities and towns and 17 counties across our country. Streets and highways, Francis Marion National Forest, University in Florence, the Francis Marion Hotel in Charleston, opened in 1924, 100 years ago, and guess what dance was going on at that time? to Charleston. So it created, some excitement for the Francis Marion Hotel. Now, the Francis Marion Hotel, like I say, has been there for 100 years. President John F. Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, General Mark Clark, Elvis Presley, Bob Hope. Those are some of the well-known figures who have stayed in the Francis Marion Hotel. Francis Marion is the grandfather of Special Forces and Rangers. Even the Navy and the Coast Guard have boats, ships named after him. Outside Columbia at McEntire Air National Guard Base, the 169th Fighter Wing, home of the Swamp Fox. Whatever happened to Oscar? Well, Oscar outlived Francis, and we don't think he ever married. He had two sisters who outlived him, so a lot of the information came from those two sisters who shared their memories of Francis Marion. In 1996, Oscar, or Buddy as he was called by Francis Marion, was recognized in a ceremony at the U.S. Capitol as an African-American patriot with a proclamation signed by then President Bush. Here in Georgetown County, we have several historical markers and or plaques designating sites of skirmishes, battles, and or Francis Marion activity. We need several more historical sites that are not recognized, and just like his hit-and-run tactics, Francis Marion continues to show up at different times since his death. When the Confederacy, when they were in operation, they had a $10 bill. Guess who was on it? Francis Marion and the potato dinner. In 1959, you can see the headlines over to the right. Walt Disney considers TV film series on Francis Marion's life in this area. The producers of that show that was about to be shown had come to Georgetown to see if Georgetown could possibly be used as one of the places to shoot the film. I can't verify this, but they found out that some of those Tories may be hiding at a well-known place known as the Sunset Lodge, so they nixed that idea. The series came out in 1959. You can see Francis Marion and Buddy. They starred in it. I'm not forgetting you. I can't talk and do something at the same time. But the show ran for about 3 years. It produced a lot of spin-offs, even a song. Y'all remember that song? Connie does. But records, coloring books, comic books, board games, more comic books, even a flintlock pistol that you could order from Canada Dry with 2 bottle tops and 50 cents. So, Francis Marion, they found a new audience with him, with children and adults. It was a very popular series, and we're thankful because that reintroduced Francis Marion to the general public at that time. In 1982, the U.S. Postal Service, they issued postcards, and who's on the front? Francis Marion with a little brief history on a battle or a skirmish. In 2000, The Patriot came out with Mel Gibson. It was based on the life of Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens. But everybody thinks this was Francis Marion. Now, the movie was a hit, but it wasn't a hit with the actual history. It was all Hollywood. Part of the movie was filmed at Mansfield Plantation, the Avenue of Oaks. Even the house that was burned was filmed at Mansfield. The Hollywood, they produced a facade, and they burned it right there at Mansfield. Fire trucks, everybody was out there in case something caught on fire, but it was a very dramatic scene in the movie. Even Hallmark got in. They started producing the American Spirit dolls. American people, Francis Marion was one of those. Now, thankfully, every year, February 27th, they have a commemorative program at the graveside of Francis Marion. It was started by, Connie, you probably remember Kitty Tanner. Susan, y'all remember Kitty Tanner? She, Her husband died, and she married a guy from Moncks Corner, but she started this. But they have a big turnout every year. The SAR, DAR, other historical organizations, they put wreaths, they have a speaker, have a large crowd. Sometimes they'll have a cannon firing. Then they have 2 jets, sometimes 4 jets flying over. And guess where the jets are from? The Swamp Fox Brigade. Now, Francis Marion. The name of Francis Marion hasn't faded and needs to be reintroduced to our citizens today. Thankfully, well, let's skip that. We have a lot more to do to make sure his name is spread far and wide throughout Georgetown County. The South Carolina 250th Commission was formed in 2022, and each county has its own commission. I'm glad to see Ken, Libby, several other 250 committee members here. We thank y'all for doing what y'all do and have done. But South Carolina will be celebrating from 2026 to 2032, and this is just 2024. The Georgetown County 250th Commission meets once a month at the County Museum and offers programs and events to introduce citizens to Francis Marion and the American Revolution. And just for your information, there is a meeting tonight at 6 o'clock. Georgetown was also selected to be the Francis Marion Interpretive Center for the state of South Carolina. It will officially open early next year. Some of you may have noticed this wooden frame being constructed on the side of the County Museum. Well-known mural artist Tommy Simpson should be finishing this mural by the end of the month. It was sponsored by the Georgetown County 250th Commission and will become an annual event throughout the 6-year celebration. Also in Georgetown, last March, we had the Day of the Fox, where we celebrate Francis Marion History Day. It will be the March 1st of 2025. That was from last year. But there are reenactments at Francis Marion Park and Rainey Park. The kids, the adults, all come out and learn American Revolutionary history. There's a colonial camp every year, sponsored by Flo Phillips. She teaches the children Revolutionary War history. For the past 2 years, the 250th Commission here in Georgetown, we've had a Carolina Day celebration where we remember the battle at Sullivan's Island. We've had great press. This is Ken talking to a news media person from Charleston, but we had good media coverage from Charleston to Myrtle Beach. We have speakers who speak on Francis Marion and the American Revolutionary War. This was at Winya Auditorium this past March. Constitution Week, this is a display right out here in the library. Every year, the DAR, they celebrate the Constitution Week from September 17th to the 23rd. Just 2 days ago, this past Tuesday, General George Washington and Martha Washington, they were there. Excellent program, well attended. The DAR, this is something to put on your calendars. Coming up in November, they're going to have a display at the Georgetown County Museum. There will be these pull-up panels that give information on different things during the American Revolutionary War, but mainly they highlight people you've never heard of, people who were instrumental in helping us win, our victory over the British. So that will run the entire month of November. It will finish up first part of December. On December 5th, the Georgetown County Museum and 250th Commission, we will be celebrating the Georgetown Tea Party. We had a tea party here in Georgetown back in 1775. You're going to learn all about it. And at the end of that program, guess what's going to be dumped into the Sandpit River? Tea. And you can see, told the story in the December 12, 1774 issue, the Committee of Observation at Georgetown, having discovered that a cask of tea was lately imported there, applied to the master of the vessel that brought it to destroy it, which he immediately did. So we're going to recreate that in December. In January 6th, we're having a meeting at the Winya Indigo Society Hall that will be open to the public. But we have, Ken, why don't you brief everybody on that? You're a little more.
Sure. Well, Cincinnati, the American Revolution Institute instructors from Washington, D.C. Are going to come down once a week, and they're going to teach the teachers local social studies curriculum people. And so which is a very good thing. So they're reigniting the passion of the revolution to our local teachers, which is really needed. So we're taking advantage of the fact that they're going to be here that day, and we are going to use the same instructors to give an evening presentation at the Window Society Hall. So that will be an event that it is open to the public, but I have to say there's limited seating here, so there'll be limited tickets. Right? So we're gonna have registration for this one. Unfortunately, we'd love to have it, larger, but it's gonna be a great thing. We'll be taping it, so even if you can't make it, you'll be able to see it online. So.
Thank you, sir. Now, what can you do to help educate our children and citizens? You can help by being an active member of the 250th Committee. We need to introduce Francis Marion to those who come behind us and explain why his story is worth telling. The things that make Francis Marion's stories exceptional are not his military tactics, his victories, or his small band of followers. His character and the way he interacted with the people who played a part of his life are the things that elevate his stature. He can serve as a role model for today's children and young people, as he is the quintessential, I can't say that word, underdog. He was a sickly child, small in size, partially crippled, and moderately educated. His dark eyes and sharp features considered unhandsome by today's standards. Francis Marion was a good man in extremely brutal situations, fighting and determined, and far more powerful than his evil adversaries. He prevailed not by brutal strength, but by his intellect, high moral principles, a sense of compassion for his troops and the enemy, physical toughness, incredible bravery, and military tactics. Like all of us, he is not without his flaws, but he is a magnificent role model. I hope many of you would like to learn more about South Carolina's hero, Francis Marion. I have several books over here. No, you can't take them, but you can look at those and put that on your reading list. In closing, I would like to quote the first stanza of William Cullen Bryant's 1831 tale of Francis Marion's song. Our band is few, but true and tried, our leader frank and bold. The British soldier trembles when Marion's name is told. I thank you for the opportunity of speaking to you this morning. Hopefully you've learned something new about the Revolutionary War, about Francis Marion here in Georgetown, here in South Carolina. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Thank you very much.